And we are live on the YouTube.
All right, welcome everybody. It's the 3rd of April, and we are here with the House Energy and Digital Infrastructure Committee to learn about Vermont conservation design. And it's related. We take a lot of foundational testimony here, and so this is related to H394 in kind of a broader sense. And so that's why we've invited you folks to come. So we'll go around and quickly introduce ourselves and then turn it over for the record. I'm Rep. Kathleen James from Bennington 4 District. Okay.
Richard Bailey, Memorial 2.
Tomorrow, Wyndham, Windsor, Bennington.
Michael Southworth, Caledonia 2.
Christopher Howland, Rutland 4.
Territory, Washington 2.
And Cliff Notion in 13 Burlington.
Great. Laura Spilling, Wyndham 3.
Great.
Jack Locker, Committee Assistant.
Thomas, would you want to?
Sure. Thomas Weiss, resident of Montpelier, interested in your topic today.
Excellent. All right, for the record.
For the record, my name is Andrea Shortsleeve, and I am the interim commissioner at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I guess,
I'm Robert Zano. I'm a natural community ecologist with the department.
and regrettably, I also have to leave because our policy initiative bill is being testified on in House Environment, so I need to be there starting at 11 as well. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm going to leave you in very competent hands with Bob. Bob's an ecologist for our department. He's been working for the department for 17 years, and he's our expert in natural communities and landscape ecology. And in his work, he works with foresters, consultants, landowners, graduate students, other scientists, kind of the whole gamut. And he also works in a regulatory world, which he'll mention in a little more detail in a second. But most notably, Bob's work he's been one of the principal drivers of this idea called Vermont conservation design, which is a scientific framework for conserving Vermont's ecological function into the future. And so it integrates species and habitats and integrates all of the work that we do at the department, which I think I mentioned earlier in this session when I came to talk to you all. It's a project that was developed by our department and in consultation with all of our conservation partners, starting in the spring of 2015. And so I just want to make sure, so Billy Coster, who works for the Agency of Natural Resources, our central office, is really the go-to for kind of larger questions about the agency's position on this bill. But we're really excited that Vermont Conservation Design, there's interest in it and just being used in different applications and different contexts. We just want to recognize that there's a lot of nuance in the design and when it's being applied. And so we want to make sure that it's well understood. And so we are very thankful to have this opportunity to run through Vermont conservation design with you all and to discuss it. And so with that, I will pass it to Bob and I'll slip out in a couple minutes. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair James and members of the committee for the opportunity to be here. Just to add a little bit to what Commissioner Shortsleeve said about my background, my work involves detailed ecological fieldwork at times, going out into the woods, finding important places, understanding the plants and animals that are there. It involves working to understand how to manage and protect those places so that we maintain species into the future. And sometimes that intersects with Act 250 and Section 248, where the department, through the agency process, will weigh in on the criteria for reviewing those projects. So I have a wide range of stuff from being knee deep in a swamp to being in the middle of testimony related to 248 at times. I wanted to start with the mission of the department, which maybe you're familiar with, but it's really what drove us to creating Vermont conservation design, this mission of conserving all the fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. And that's very broad. The best estimates are that there could be up to 40,000 different species here in Vermont. And most of them are things we know little or basically nothing about. You can see that yellow slice of the pie is just a tiny bit. That's the vertebrate animals, birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, just a couple hundred species in that pie. Even plants are just a small slice of that pie. And there's things like fungi, mosses and liverworts, invertebrate animals, so things like dragonflies, mollusks, all of these things that are out there important to the ecosystem functioning, playing roles that we might not fully understand, but we want to conserve all the parts so that we protect everything that we know is out here in nature in Vermont. So that's a big challenge. How do we do that? And luckily, this is not a new problem for conservation science. We certainly can't go species by species. We'd go crazy trying to work on 20 to 40,000 different species. So instead, we think about finding larger things that are out there in nature that serve as a proxy for all those many species. And if we conserve those larger features, so here, for example, if we conserve an alder swamp along a stream, we're conserving common plants like speckled alder, like false hellebore, and then maybe we're also conserving species like wood turtle, which is uncommon in Vermont. Likewise, if we conserve a black spruce swamp in the Northeast Kingdom, we get many common plants. Also, maybe rare animals like spruce grouse, or that rare moss shown in that photo. It's called splachna moss. It only grows on moose and deer dung. So we're not going out and finding every example of that dung moss, but if we're conserving good examples of swamps, we can say, you know what, that moss, probably many other species, we're conserving them, whatever role it's playing in the ecosystem to support all the other plants and animals, we can sort of check that off and say, yes, we've got that. And so through this, we can get great efficiency in our conservation work. We don't have to think about every species. It frees us up to work on those that need the most attention. And I'll kind of come back to that theme at the end here. We also know that there's a challenge, a long-term challenge in growing species by species, that the species that are here now have not always been here. And unfortunately, they're not always likely to be here in the future, especially given the rate of climate change that we're experiencing. So these maps are maps of the distribution of common trees going back to about 12,000 years ago when the continent was glaciated. And so on the left side, you see beech and hemlock on the top. And you can see those two trees, which are very common trees. They're growing together outside, back behind the State House here. 12,000 years ago, when there was glacial ice, totally different climate, they were living two separate places. And over time, they shifted in response to the changing climate, and now they grow together. If we project that forward, there's no guarantee that all the assemblages of species we have now will continue to be together the same way. They won't move as units. Each species is going to move individually. So we've got tens of thousands of species, all responding differently and doing something unique that we can't really predict. So that's part of the conservation challenge now.
Yeah. No, I think go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm curious about this, but given where climate change is at now, I mean, it's only been 50 years or so that we've seen the, the direct impacts on the ground. Is that too short a time for you to be able to understand the pace of migration of species, or are you able to model that in some way?
I know there's been a lot of work about the modeling. I'm not intricately familiar with all the details. I think a lot of that modeling, all models are useful, but no, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think that's a good approach to take with any particular species model. The Nature Conservancy did an overall review of known range shifts, and they have some numbers which I should know off the top of my head, but I don't. But they were finding actual noticeable range shifts. Not huge, but big enough that it can be tracked in overall studies of multiple species populations.
Yeah.
I'll just say I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I do know the miles per year and 1,000 foot of elevation per year for deer ticks is very well studied and known because of their value as a vector for disease.
Right, that's clearly. Yeah, I was thinking more about like these species that are important to our economy, like the sugar maple, things like that. Yeah.
Right. Sugar maple is an interesting one because that the range extends all the way down to Georgia, I believe. So it's probably not likely to disappear, as I understand it, but our sugaring season might be radically different.
Right. Thank you.
I guess pulling all those challenges together is what got us here to Vermont Conservation Design. How do we protect all these species, maintain the functions of the ecosystem, even when we know all the parts are going to be shifting, changing, unpredictable? How do we keep species here? How do we maintain biodiversity, even if the actors change over time? So Vermont Conservation Design identifies the places, the lands and waters that are most important for maintaining ecological function. And it's a stacking up of these large scale features to create this overall design. And ecological function is really, it's about maintaining all the species that are here now, but also,
Sorry, can you go back to the last slide?
Yes.
One more back.
one
There
more,
we go. That one, yeah.
this one,
I
sure.
didn't quite have enough time to memorize the map. That was important.
There's a delay that we see, so.
Oh,
go
okay.
for it.
Sorry.
Instantaneous on my computer.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That one,
Yeah, just a second.
yes. And I'm going to dig into these piece by piece, what we're going to stack up. This idea of ecological function, I was starting to say, is about maintaining species because we need all the parts, but it's also about allowing them to go through everything that life involves, the reproduction, migration, movement, not just sort of keeping them static in a museum. And I think boiling that down to 3 words, it's about maintaining a landscape, a natural landscape that's intact, connected, and diverse. So in creating the design, we started with this idea of efficiency and finding broad features. And what was the set of features that if we put them all together, were most efficient at conserving many, many species and all those processes that we want for ecological function. And this here is basically the list. And we think about it in 3 scales: landscape scale features that are big and broad, natural communities and habitats that are a little smaller, a little more focused. And then there's this idea of how we deal with the individual species at the end of that. So I want to walk through these parts. At the landscape scale, a fundamental unit is this idea of the forest block or habitat block. And it's a unit of intact forest and other natural cover. So it might not actually be tree. It could be like a beaver wetland, the alpine meadow in Camel's Hump. But it's natural vegetation functioning under largely natural processes. There might be timber harvest, there might be trails, but it's essentially an intact natural system. And it's bounded by roads, development, and agriculture. And I think it's a really intuitive unit. You walk into the woods, you're walking through the woods, you walk through the swamp, you walk through more woods over a ridge, and eventually you come out in a house or a farm field, and you can say, I've walked out of that habitat block, out of that forest block. When we started this project, our mapping of the forest blocks looked like this. And just last year, we released updated data that went from this very blocky mapping to extremely high resolution mapping of forest blocks, which was really revolutionary in how we could view the edges of these, where these forested blocks are. You can see the difference between this to this, just all the little stringy connections on the landscape that suddenly pop. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. This was created using LiDAR data that the University of Vermont Spatial Analysis Lab put together. It's just incredible data. So when we mapped those forest blocks, we mapped about 4,000 of them across the whole state that are bigger than 20 acres. There'd be even more if we went smaller than 20 acres, but that was just the cutoff we used. Of those 4,000 blocks, then we started prioritizing them based on certain ecological functions. And the first one is the most intuitive. It's interior forest, essentially the big patches of woods. But we know that forest in the Champlain Valley, the patch sizes are very different than like the Northeast Kingdom, the Green Mountains. And we wanted to make sure that we represented those different regions of the state. So we chose the biggest forest blocks in each of the state's 9 biophysical regions, which is an ecological unit that's described. And we often use it for ecological work. So you can see here, it's a little hard to, I'm not sure if we can see there. canyon. So this is Snake Mountain here. It's a small block of forest compared to the spine of the mountains or the Northeast Kingdom, but in the Champlain Valley, it's a critical place, one of the best forest blocks for maintaining ecological function. So these are highlighted as highest priority. For each of these features, we offer guidelines for maintaining ecological function. And the guidelines for these forest blocks are relatively broad. It's about maintaining that function of interior forest, avoiding permanent fragmentation into the center of those blocks. If there's going to be permanent impacts, keeping them on the edge so that it minimizes the influence of that development. Forest management that maintains a distribution of age classes and structures is totally compatible with these forest blocks. And another guideline is to try to minimize the spread of invasive species within them.
That picture in the lower right is illustrating development in the middle of a forest block.
It's illustrating development in the middle of the forest block. Yes. So that's what we would hope not to see in those places. Long, long roads going up into the middle of the forest to put some sort of permanent development.
Privately owned land, which if they own it, they have the right to do that, correct?
They absolutely do. Yep. So this is an ecological window into what's the priorities. I think how the priorities are used is at the crux of what you're going to be dealing with the way that Vermont conservation design has worked into this bill, and it's been the crux of using it in the Act 250 work last year. So this is not in itself telling anyone what they can or cannot do. It's offering that the best way to maintain ecological function in these places is to avoid that fragmenting influence.
I'll just add, because I worked on last term, that's why we looked at the road rule to make it for new construction harder to do that or in the wrong places. How else, you gotta have some tools.
Privately owned land, I totally disagree with that limitation, but we'll move on because that's going into a different area.
But this ecological system could be available for conventional harvesting of logs and the other output of the property.
Absolutely.
And just to make sure folks understand, in H 394, Vermont conservation design is it's an existing tool, planning tool or approach that lives outside of, we're not voting on, debating, or revising Vermont conservation design. It's something that I guess you consider or refer to in the bill.
Is it involved with the siting of?
It's mentioned as something you should think about.
On the last page.
Mhm.
Just to really emphasize the point that we created VCD, Vermont Conservation Design, to be informative, to set a vision of what we could do and where the important places are. The mechanism there's many ways to get at that, and there's inevitably going to be conflicts and discussion around how we achieve the long-term success and what's appropriate and inappropriate. So this is meant to be that scientific vision. Those interior forest blocks don't form a connected network. They were chosen because they're the largest, but the largest blocks are not always in proximity to other. But like I was saying, we need the ability for species to move. So we went back and we created a network of blocks that's continuous, so that species can move across the landscape. This is important for like the individual moose that wants to wander from central Vermont up into the Northeast Kingdom, back down into central Vermont, and then over to New Hampshire, which is what one moose actually did in our state a few years ago. It's also important as we think about how species are going to move. If we lose some of our key tree species, how do we get red oak moving up across the landscape to replace the species that are dropping out? Here, it's not just about the interior of the block. It might actually be the edge-to-edge connections on either side of a road where it's critical to have that close proximity of forest. Losing that might have great implications for the long-term movements of plants and animals. And Vermont is in this crossroads of connectivity in the region. So when we think about these overall range shifts of species, Vermont connects the Adirondacks all the way up to the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec. It connects the Berkshires in Massachusetts up into the Sutton Mountains in Quebec, and allows that long pathway all the way over to Nova Scotia. We're at the center of where everything is crossing. And so if we lose our connections, it has these broader implications for the region. Taking that down to a very local scale, this really high resolution mapping of forest blocks has given us a whole new window into where there might be these very specific pathways. And so you can see on the left, the old mapping, in that purple box, it doesn't really call out anything special. On the right, we can now see there's this thread of forest that connects these two forest blocks, and those very specific points on that road might be important places for animals to move across the road. These road crossings are really key, and it's a big part of the department's work. We work closely with AOT on this. Our crossings are not like those out west where you have herds of antelope crossing a road. It's one animal at a time, and it's not always in predictable locations. So having that permeability is important. And animals will move across the top of the road. They'll also move under the road through culverts and bridges if they have enough room. Something that's nice is when we build culverts with enough room to provide flood resilience, they're typically also the right size for wildlife to be moving under the road too. So we get this overlapping benefit of, well, all the good that comes from maintaining our water infrastructure well. The third landscape piece of Vermont conservation design is getting at representing all the different settings of Vermont. We can't conserve all of Vermont's species if we just conserve the high mountains and the cold regions of the Northeast Kingdom, the places that have historically been mostly set aside for conservation. We need to think about the valleys where there's a lot of our biological diversity. And so we looked at things like bedrock, elevation, to create a set of blocks that represents the full range of features. And here's an example of the bedrock geology map of Vermont, and then some of the species that are really tied to certain physical conditions. And one of my favorite is that butterfly. It's called the West Virginia white. It requires a certain plant that only grows in forests that have calcium-rich soils. And those forests are typically only found where the bedrock has high levels of calcium. So if you want to conserve that butterfly, you've got to conserve the forests that have that plant and that are on that particular bedrock type. This is also important as we think about species movements. They need some combination of physical setting and climate, and those combinations will change over time. So we need to give species as many possibilities to find the right combo in the future. All those forest blocks are really key to the design. It's at the heart of it, I think, along with the surface waters and riparian areas. And we know that water is a connected network. You can't tease apart a portion of a river without affecting other parts of a river or stream. Lakes and ponds are all connected. All of that is really highest priority for maintaining ecological function. And so we've mapped out broad areas, broad riparian areas, to recognize where all those functions happen in the valley bottom of Vermont. It's a little broader than the river corridor or the floodplain where there's more focused regulatory work, but it's the whole area that's shaped by the river over the long term.
A question about the volume of water we're getting these days. You know, it's indicated by all the flooding. But does that significantly alter the ecology of our streams and rivers, or does it just bounce back really quickly after a flood event like that?
I think,
or is that a complicated question?
I think it's a bit of a complicated question. I hesitate to answer because I might be a bit out of my expertise, but I know that some things will bounce back and some things I think will be changed. And a lot of it has to do with how functional the river is, as I understand it. If it has its correct geomorphic processes, I think it's going to be more resilient to some of those things than if it doesn't, if it's been channeled and strafed or dredged. But that would really be a good question for a fisheries science or one of the aquatic folks at PEC.
Yeah.
These riparian areas they're critical for their function supporting the water quality and the flow. they also are key pathways for wildlife to move across the landscape. So here's a map of the Champlain Valley around Snake Mountain and the Otter Creek and Dead Creek. Those brown vegetated areas connect forest blocks shown in orange. So species are moving through the Champlain Valley. They're using those pathways along the sides of rivers and streams.
I'm sorry, just out of curiosity. What caused Dead Creek to become dead?
I don't know where it gets that name from.
Well, it's clearly flooded. Something happened at its egress into Otter Creek.
Right, I believe Fish and Wildlife maintains a series of dams that control water to promote waterfowl in that area. I don't think that's where the name of the creek comes from, but I'm dangerously close to speculating here.
Okay, thank you.
Those landscape features are the biggest features of the design. I think if we just protected those by themselves, if we maintained that here in Vermont, we could have pretty high confidence we'd have a lot of species here into the future. By adding in this next piece, natural communities and habitats, it gives us increased confidence in maintaining species into the future. And I want to talk about a few of these. There's a list of them that you can see there, and just highlight how these layer into these broader landscape level features. First one is natural communities, which is the core of my work. These are assemblages of plants and animals, their physical environment that's shaping them. Here's just 4 natural communities found in the state. We have 97 types that we've recognized that we see again and again. Even if you've never thought about natural communities, you can probably sort of intuitively think about places that would fit some of these, like a river cobble shore, alpine meadow, red oak northern hardwood forest, or this red maple black gum swamp. Each of these has their own species, their own reasons for being there, so that the processes that shape the river cobble shore are really different than the processes that make the alpine meadow what it is on the top of Camel Sump. Those places will likely always be different into the future, even if the climate changes. The top of Camel Sump is always going to be shaped by those mountain factors. The river is always going to be shaped by those riverine factors. So when we think about maintaining species into the future, if we maintain all of these natural communities, each one of them will support different biodiversity going forward. We may not know exactly what, but we know it'll be something unique to that spot. Another piece of the habitat scale features is thinking about these different conditions across the landscape, ensuring that we have a variety of structures in our forest and also grasslands and shrublands, and having some balance of these so that they provide habitat for the species that needs it. We can't have we need a diversity of forest structures and of other habitats to support many species. And so Vermont Conservation Design has targets for young and old forest. Because of our land use history, most of our forest is middle-aged. It mostly is redeveloping after the clearing for agriculture that happened in the 19th century. So most of our forest is about 100 years old, give or take, and that's really middle age for a forest. We lack young forest and we lack old forest. And those are both really important habitats. And here's why. This is a chart showing forest age across the bottom, and then sort of normalized, not the actual number, but like all compiled into one chart curve showing the overall abundance of species in these 3 categories: plants, animals, and fungi. And you can see there's a great diversity of plants and animals in the very young forest. And then that drops. And then finally, when you get to older forests, you get a great diversity of plants, animals, and fungi again. That middle-aged forest, which is what we have the most of, is actually pretty low in terms of plant and animal diversity. So by bringing those edges back, we can enhance the abundance and number of species that can find a place in our forest. And there's many, many ways to do this, and that's sort of beyond the scope of the presentation here. There's a lot of discussion now about how to recreate old forest, how to get young forest. I think there's a whole range of strategies, and it's a super cool discussion. But I'm going to leave it at that for now. Another feature here is grasslands. And there's a set of birds that rely on open grasslands for nesting. Bobolink is one of the most well-known of those. Also meadowlark. There's some other rarer ones like upland sandpiper. These species originally were primarily prairie species, although they were here in Vermont, as I understand. But as much of the prairie was turned into very intensive agriculture, these species rely more and more on the habitats that we have here, our agricultural grasslands, hayfields. And so they've become a part of our biodiversity. And we want to maintain that here. These are just key charismatic species in our state. And to do that means thinking really strategically about where we can manage grasslands for these birds' specific needs so that their nests are not getting run over during the hay season. They can raise their young and continue to thrive here in Vermont. And so this map is not a map of all that yellow is not meant to be conserved, but it's meant to show within there it would be really important for maintaining these species if we can set aside some acres that are managed really with these birds in mind so they can continue to persist. The other parts of this habitat and natural community scale are wetlands, underground habitats, which is caves and mines, really important for bats. But also there's probably many species in caves and mines that we know nothing about. There's some further prioritization of the rivers and streams and lakes and ponds to highlight the places that are really providing some of the biodiversity value. And vernal pools, they're a wetland, but just calling them out specifically because they're such a unique type of wetland. I think that's everything that's in that category.
Well, while you're on that, can you just give us a quick update on the bats? Are they bouncing back?
I'm not the person to give that update, but I don't believe so.
No.
Yeah. Been saying about this idea of confidence that we were layering in confidence as we add units here, add features. So we started with landscapes. We add these features in to enhance the landscapes. And I think just with those two things, the landscapes and the natural communities and habitats, we have high confidence we've met the needs of many, many species in Vermont. We've done some back of the envelope analysis and think that this would capture essentially every common species that we know of, which is a small subset. And it would provide for, I think, maybe something like half of the rare species and species of greatest conservation need that we have. They would find their habitat somewhere in there likely. And so this really brings efficiency to how we could approach conservation in the department and broadly in the state. Here's an example of that. Two very rare species. The one on the left is pale painted cup, which is a relative of the Western paintbrush, the bright scarlet paintbrush. Here in Vermont, it grows in one place. It grows at the base of the cliffs in Smuggler's Notch, way up there. You can see here's a picture of me trying to do some inventory in Smuggler's Notch, and that's the habitat that this plant is going to be found in. It's extremely rare here, but if we protect that habitat and that landscape and give it room to do what it needs to do and maybe move further north over time or uphill, that's about all we need to do for this species. I would say that that one's captured by the features we have in the design. In contrast, there's the turtle, the spiny softshell, that nests on these tiny little beaches and is extremely susceptible to trampling by people, predation by other animals, because when you have a bunch of nests all in one spot, the other animals figure that out and they know that's a quick place to get some food. So if it wasn't for this very hands-on work, here's Tony McCullough, one of our department staff, showing how to find these nests to some volunteers. If it wasn't for that, these fences, all this effort, that turtle would probably not persist in Vermont. That's a species that's not captured by Vermont conservation design. And this can help us triage and prioritize. We can work on the species like that. We can set other ones and say, you know what? I think we're good. We don't have to spend a lot of time and money on them.
Is that a native species?
Yes, yeah. So we stack all those pieces up. This is showing the map of what we can map. And this is a guide. It's a way to understand, to maintain species. here are the places that would be most important for doing that. And a way to break it down and say, in each of the places identified on this map, what strategies might be appropriate. In a forest block, it might be very general. Maintaining the alpine meadow on Camel Sump might be very intensive. Vermont conservation design is not prescriptive, but it provides a window into how you might approach any one of these features. Altogether, I think we can say this maintains nature and all the benefits. It's protecting that intact, connected, and diverse landscape. It's conserving species and their habitats. And it's our plan to allow nature to adapt to this changing climate. We're not going to be able to move things and tinker to solve it. Nature's going to have to solve this big problem. And this gives nature room to do that. It's a lot of Vermont identified on that map. And I've acknowledged that right off the bat. And I just want to put that in context. Here's a map of all of the forested and natural land in the state right now. I think it's something like just shy of 80%. This is what it would look like if we just protected the areas identified as highest priority in Vermont conservation design. So I'm going to go back and forth just to try to show that. To my eye, there's a lot of green that's lost in those, between those two. If we were just to implement Vermont conservation design, I think we would lose a lot of the landscape that supports plants and animals, and also supports just the values that a lot of Vermonters have about what the landscape could look like. So I think the design is absolutely a prioritization that if we were to implement only this, it would be a big change for the state. And I like to say we did this as a science project. We didn't really approach it with any other lens other than what do we need to protect species? But when we got to the other end, we realized, well, if we maintain this functional landscape, we get a whole lot more. This is the landscape that provides us recreation, clean water, our sense of place. It supports working farms and forests, and all the benefits that we get, like flood resilience, clean air, everything that we get from having functional nature around us.
Yes.
Of the map we showed that had the areas you've identified as important. Do you have a sense for what % of that is currently protected?
Yes, I think that's about 30-ish%. The forest blocks are a little bit better protected than the riparian areas. So I think it's something like 40%-ish of the forest blocks and closer to high 20s for those riparian areas. I can dig up exact numbers if that's something you're interested in. That's a lot of that is ongoing work that's part of the Act 59 30x30 process. And I think there's going to be more information coming out about that from VHCB. Land conservation, though, it's a good question, though, because it's definitely not going to be land conservation alone that's going to be the answer to this. We can't sustain that much of Vermont just by buying it and locking it up. That would just not work. And so I think the way we get at maintaining a functional landscape is using the full range of conservation approaches. Yes, the acquisition, permanent conservation of land is a key part for really important places. There's a whole bunch of incentives. The use value appraisal program is probably the reason we have this landscape now, maintaining working forests and allowing landowners to keep that land as forest rather than subdividing or selling that land. Just having good landowner stewardship is a key part of maintaining this functional landscape. And our outreach to landowners is a big part of the department's work, just encouraging people to steward their land thoughtfully. And I think that range, and people can plug in where they would like along that spectrum. The department has been using this in several ways. We first created the design about 10 years ago, and so we've had a little bit of time now to grow into how we use it. It helps us select the lands that we want to acquire for new wildlife management areas. It also informs the agency's land conservation work. It can inform our management of state-owned lands. Like I said, we provide technical assistance to landowners. And a key part of that is sometimes just showing landowners how their individual property fits into that bigger picture. We use this through the Act 250 process and Section 248 process, where there's certain criteria for how we look at projects, and then we might use Vermont conservation design to inform our use of our look through that lens. And it's very similar to how we would use like deer wintering areas. They're not specifically in Act 250, but they can be used when we're looking at that significant wildlife habitat. I'm going to talk a bit more about 248 on the next slide. We also work with towns to help them apply Vermont conservation design in their town planning.
To that last one. So some of the towns in my district have done quite a lot of work in, assessing our natural resources, and so some of our local conservation commissions are able to work with community members to get a key piece. But I'm wondering, does it require the granularity for town planning? Does it require more investment in these kind of local mapping exercises and research beyond what your big tool captures?
I think for the most part, the landscape scale features with this high resolution mapping, they really scale down really well.
Okay.
Where I believe towns often or sometimes do more intensive inventory is into the habitats and rare species. And I know certain towns have hired contractors, done more thorough inventories of some of those features, and then use that with the Vermont conservation design data to inform how they develop their town.
At our
planning.
scale. Yeah.
Yeah, at that very local scale.
Right.
And also bringing in community values.
Right.
And Jens Hilke from the Fish and Wildlife Department works with towns through that process and helps them bring in their values and their info and use Vermont conservation design as a tool, not as just like this immediate stamp, really tailoring it to the needs of the town.
I heard you say agriculture once in your presentation. Not all agricultural lands are. What's the role of agricultural lands in this whole process? Because they can be useful and diverse, and depending on how they're used, right?
Yeah, great question. I think they definitely intersect. Maybe not easily, but they intersect with the grassland birds. For sure, that grassland birds are making use of some of those agricultural lands when they're able to. Agricultural land it's a human created condition. And so it's a little different than some of the natural features that are the primary focus of the design. But I think we also know that there's a whole suite of invertebrates, other creatures that use that edge habitat that are likely present in some of those places. I don't know a lot about them, and it's hard to describe and map those edges. I think it's safe to say that the center of a cornfield probably has not a tremendous contribution to biodiversity, but the edges of those fields and those fallow areas or hay fields, those probably are making contributions. And it's hard to capture that in this statewide scale. I think that's maybe more as we get into the species by species piece. What uses those sandy edges, for example? And again, Vermont conservation design is trying to get at one set of values, right? It's trying to get at this idea of protecting species. And I think agricultural lands have a whole other set of values too that makes them and their conservation, gives it its own standing. It's sort of separate from the design, albeit maybe complementary at times. Here's just some specific about Vermont conservation design and energy siting. This is, I work on that 248 process. I'm not deep into some of the details here. So I'd really encourage you to hear from others who might be more familiar with how some of this is used. I wasn't involved in this process, but the Vermont conservation design landscape features are included in the guidance for Act 174 as possible constraints for the siting of energy projects. And then some of those habitat scale features rare species, significant natural communities, vernal pools, and wetlands are listed as known constraints in the guidance for Act 174.
I'm sorry, what does RT mean? Rare?
Rare, threatened, and endangered. Thank you. When the agency reviews projects that go through Section 248, we review it through the lens of will the project have an undue adverse effect on the natural environment with consideration of the Act 250 criteria. And when we look at projects, we can consider if a project's impact to a forest block or some of the other features of Vermont conservation design might rise to that level of an undue adverse effect on the natural environment. I haven't personally had any cases that I've reviewed in I've taken on this work over about the past 3 or 4 years. I haven't had any renewable energy projects that raise to the level of an undue adverse impact on the natural environment because of Vermont conservation design, I believe. But I think that has come up in the past where the agency has pursued that line. So the pieces are being considered, but they're through the lens of the existing process. I guess some final thoughts on Vermont conservation design. I think I've said this many times, but it's a vision for the future. It's informative. It's not prescriptive. It can guide us. It's not a buffet. It's not one where we can pick out certain pieces and say we like this piece of the design and don't like this piece, so we're only going to focus on one part. I think we really need all these pieces of the design working together to maintain ecological function. What's nice is that it shows people how individual conservation work fits into the larger picture. One organization might work on one part of this design. The Ruffed Grouse Society might be focusing on creating young forest, and this shows how that work fits into this larger picture. Yeah.
Is anyone taking your work and doing like a ecosystem services kind of economic mapping of what these forest lands or other areas that you're talking about, what they mean to us from an economical point of view?
Good question. I know there's been work done on the economics of conserved lands. I don't think I'm aware of any work that has tried to quantify the economic value specifically related to the design. It'd be fascinating for someone to do.
Sounds like a UVM PhD candidate needs a project.
There's the full conservation toolbox. And then I think really the design can help us strike this balance of how nature and people can thrive in Vermont. I think the thing that I'm perhaps most excited about is that the design shows us our ecological priorities and by default then also shows us places that might be more suited to development and what we need as people.
Okay. Bailey.
Were all these species here when the state was 87% clear cut?
I guess we don't know. We don't know how many species were absent and have come back. We know that there are species that were absent and came back, some by themselves and some because we intentionally did that. I mean, species like white-tailed deer and beavers and turkeys, things that we just take for granted now, were gone or nearly gone during that time frame. So I think there's surely were species that were not here, but what they were, I don't know.
Representative Tory, last question.
I'm just curious about wildlife impacts of like that house by itself up in the woods. I feel like I heard at a local trail use meeting in my community that I went to that like a disturbance like that of building a house in the woods has like a whole impact. It was almost like a 5-mile range. Do you know that statistic?
There has been work done on that. And I know in the Adirondacks, there was a study that showed that you could find impacts from a single house in the woods out to, it was not miles, but it was, I think closer to the scale of hundreds of meters.
Okay.
And I mean, we all know that some wildlife will go right past the house without thinking twice, right? Bears will come right up to our houses to get our bird seed and whatever else might be left outside. But I think there's other species that are much more sensitive to that disturbance. And even species like bears, we don't want them being around houses. We want to give them space to do what they need to do.
Okay. And again, Chair James, I think, wanted us to have an overview of this. Chair Sheldon had come in and presented her bill H 394. We're working on citing. And so thank you very much. This was a presentation.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
So we have Maria Royal here on failure of the last resort.
That was not.
That added.
Very full day.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's not nearly as exciting, and I don't have cute pictures of wildlife. I'm starting to think I went into the wrong subject area.
Switch.
Thank you. There's not a lot of information is what I'm hearing.
Well, there's like such a density of information, but you can only deal with it in kind of broad strokes. We're getting lost in the wormholes. So Maria Royal with Legislative Council. I have a few hard copies for those of you who like hard copies of a one-pager I just put together this morning. And I'll also pull it up. It's posted on the committee's webpage. And I did listen to the testimony that you received on Tuesday from Franklin Telephone. Kim Gates, I believe, came in. And there was some conversation back and forth about carrier of last resort responsibilities. What are they? What do they apply to? And that kind of thing. And I think you're on the right track. Representative Sebelia, I think, was asking all the right questions about who are they and what are their obligations. And so I will start by saying it is a little confusing because the term is not defined in Vermont in statute, and different states some have defined the term or just implicitly recognize that there are these obligations. Well, I'll talk more about it. Other states don't have something analogous to carriers of left. So it's very different depending on what state you're in. And as the market changes, competition, new technologies, broadband service, all of those things affect what a COLR is and what its obligations are. So I just wanted to set that stage. But basically the concept was derived from traditional common carrier principles. So we talked about this when we talked about utility regulation, kind of the origins of utility regulation. Generally, a company is given a franchise or monopoly to provide a service in a particular area, but in return has to provide that service to everybody who wants it in that geographic area at just and reasonable rates, right? So the basic regulatory compact. In the communications sector in particular, the term is applied to telephone or voice service. Those are the companies that have obligations traditionally to provide voice service to their customers. So Vermont has the entire state is served by, it's broken up by the incumbent local exchange carriers. So you've heard from Kim Gates, who represents one of the incumbent telephone companies, Franklin Telephone, I believe. There are 7 other what are considered independent local exchange carriers. These are traditional copper telephone networks, right? When I say the independents, who Kim was kind of speaking for, they're independent from Consolidated. Consolidated is the largest kind of incumbent traditional legacy monopoly provider. So in Vermont, those are the companies that are considered carriers of last resort. And what that means is, and I think Kim said this, if somebody in their respective service territory says, building a new house, I want voice service. They are required to bring voice service. Yes. That's it.
So maybe I'm gonna get ahead as I go, but in the case of Franklin Telephone, they're no longer building copper. And so do they have an obligation at that? So their obligation though, what is their obligation? Is it to provide voice service
Our
or?
obligation is to provide voice service. It's a business decision,
Mhm.
understandable, that new builds are going to be fiber. And that's kind of what's creating a lot of tension in the regulatory world, what their obligation should be. But right now, if they don't have to build fiber. And so if they weren't already building fiber and they had some copper network still out there and there was a new build along the copper network, they just extend the copper network.
They used to have okay.
Yeah. All of the providers are in the process. Some have completely upgraded their service territories to fiber. Franklin, I said, it's almost there, maybe 3 roads or I can't remember, but they're trying to upgrade. And that's true throughout the country. A lot of the incumbent carriers that have obligations, it's expensive copper. They can't really compete with the competitive providers that are building out fiber. So they would just assume not be required to continue to serve people on the old copper network, especially if it's doesn't make business sense in a rural high cost area to build fiber. That's the problem. These are high cost areas where you're running into issues, what to do and what obligations should there be. And that's being determined on a state by state basis at this point. And so in order to discontinue service and not have that obligation, there needs to be Public Utility Commission approval. So you can't just say pack up and leave, right? You can petition, and it might depend on, is there enough competition? Is there service? And as wireless, obviously. But even wireless is hard in our state with the different topography. Maybe not every single household will have a cell service. And so you can see it's complicated about.
And so they had a franchise for a telephone service. Do they still?
There's still service territory. So the entire state is covered.
Yeah. So
you have one provider. Everybody has one carrier of last resort.
Right.
You may have other competitive providers that overbill, that provide fiber, broadband, and you may decide, I don't need my phone line. It's just copper. I'm going to get just a VoIP phone. And I have my cell phone and I just want the internet, right? But if you want a voice service and you live at the end of the copper network, they will have to extend their network to provide a voice service. I'll just add that because DSL can be offered over that copper, you could, you have the option of purchasing of a separate service, typically broadband, over that copper network. It's DSL service. It's going to vary on how good it is, depending on where you are.
And cable, who is in Franklin Telephone's territory, can provide voice service.
Correct. That's a voice service. So I think that's part of the debate and the discussion. They have these obligations. Some of the competitors can kind of build out where they want to and are taking away, which is why they're all upgrade. They want to upgrade to fiber because they don't want competitors to come in with a better service that then is going to take away their customers. So trying to keep up. I will say, just to be clear, they're in return for these obligations. There are build out subsidies available to these companies, right? And I think you heard that 30% of Franklin Telephone's revenue is in the form of federal subsidies. So it's not like they're not getting anything in return for those obligations. I'm not here to say whether it's enough or not, it's not me, but. And those subsidies, right now, specifically for the legacy providers and the incumbents, that money's coming from the federal high cost program, which is overseen by the FCC, but administered by USAC was the entity that, was referenced, the Universal Service Administrative Company. All of the federal universal service programs are administered by USAC. So some money goes to this high cost program, which has evolved over the years, Connect America Fund, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, like they're all different, So that's evolved. And I'm talking just now about construction specifically for the common carriers of last resort. But then the Lifeline program, which is a subsidy for your actual, goes to the low income households for their service, not construction. So that's available. So there are subsidies available to help universal affordable build out of broadband. Vermont has a high cost program, but it's funded under the Vermont Universal Service Fund. And remember, I don't know if we went over it in detail, but under that fund, it's kind of the waterfall. Like it pays for the relay service, it pays for the Vermont Lifeline service, which is just a state supplement for the federal Lifeline. And most significantly, 911, which is almost all the money goes to 911. There is no money that's left over that trickles down on the high cost program. That hasn't been seen as a concern because of all of the federal funding available to be funding, whatever. I know you're hearing about that ARPA funding. So that, the state is pretty much said, we're okay. We don't need to raise money for the high cost program. There's all this federal funding that the small telecom providers are eligible for and can apply for if they want. And there have been other programs that all broadband or telephone company providers were eligible to apply for. I think was mentioned the line extension program. So subsidies are available to help build out. And then the only other thing I was going to say is just to be clear. So sometimes carrier of last resort is used interchangeably with the term eligible telecommunications carrier. It gets a little confusing, but the ETC is usually a designation that's done at the state level. The PUC does that. The programs that I just mentioned, like the high cost program, are pretty much the rural providers. I mean, that's generally who we're talking about, but it can be broader than that. So for example, the wireless providers might apply at the federal level for an ETC designation so that they can take advantage of the Lifeline subsidy. And then they have requirements to make sure any of their customers can apply and sign up for that. So then the only other thing I was going to say is Jack was kind enough to post. I remember just before I came over here, there is a report and the title kind of gives it away. And this is from 2016. There were earlier iterations. There might be a more recent iterations, but this is 2016. The title of the report is Carrier of Last Resort, Anachronism or Necessity. That's exactly like what the issue is. And for some areas, some states, some markets, maybe doesn't make so much sense anymore. On the other hand, there may be rural high cost areas where having those obligations absolutely makes sense. But that report is posted and it goes through all of the obligations in all of the states if you want to just kind of compare what's happening and some of the discussion. So that's really all that I had on this subject.
So your note on the bottom.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to, I need this for dummies.
Okay.
Sorry.
You and me both.
Not all carriers of last resort or ETCs are incumbent legacy telephone providers. Can you give me an example?
So that was that's a competitive local exchange carrier, like a wireless carrier, AT&T, Verizon. They may get designated as an ETC to provide a lifeline, to be eligible to provide the lifeline subsidy. Or they may need that designation to get other universal service support mechanisms. Also, well, not really also.
So if you're an ETC, you are also a carrier of last resort.
Yeah, but not really,
really.
because not all states have carriers of last resort as we traditionally think of them. But they're required to get that ETC designation. So it will come with some responsibilities. If you want that funding, you need to provide this service in this area to anybody who wants it at these rates, right? So that's where it gets confusing because it varies so much.
In the US, but what about in Vermont?
In Vermont, all of the incumbent local exchange carriers consolidated in the 8 independents are carriers of last resort. They have to provide voice service to any new builds, any customer that wants it.
The ETCs could be the wireless carriers.
They can get that designation to provide the lifeline subsidy, for example, all through the Ps.
Yep.
So after Franklin Telephone came in, he sent what I think was a exchange map to our webpage. And so that was, the first 3 digits of the traditional telephone number. If the way I see this carrier of last resort is the old AT&T model or the 1950 telegraph copper cable model, that they're required to extend copper cable to everybody up to where that map is. And if they chose not to, they would have to petition the PUC to abandon, to create a desert area.
Yeah.
But interpreting what Franklin Telephone said was that they're opting to extend fiber because of their business decision. And because they are now using fiber associated with internet, that they have lost their protection of the old copper cable carrier of last resort.
No, they still get their subsidy. Yep.
They get their subsidy, but unless the law changed since I retired, she said that she's now getting property tax on her value of her plan.
Yeah.
And when I worked in the industry, the telephone carriers did not pay personal property tax on the value of their copper cable. Apparently, they are paying they're paying personal property taxes on the value of their fiber. So I associated that was the difference in why the municipalities are collecting this.
That you're 100% right on the personal property tax. So what the legislature did last year, there is a 1947 law that taxes telephone personal property. It's a centralized state collected tax on telephone personal property, poles, wires, all of that stuff. And it's at net book value, certain percent. There's an alternative, and I think Kim referenced this. If you are a smaller company, you can pay a percentage of your gross receipts. That's been around for a long time.
Right. So that did come into the town grant list.
Well, it was repealed.
Okay, no, I am
So
not,
you know you're right.
Yeah,
And then
okay.
now it's going to be in the grand list
so,
as property, but taxed as real estate in the town's grand list at the non-homestead rate. That was the change that was made last year. So that's, I think, what she was saying. This may increase our tax burden. But that was delayed. The effective date was pushed out and it hasn't been enacted yet. So that,
I just wasn't up to speed. I mean,
I'm trying to stay up to speed
I
myself,
know.
but I'm not up to speed though.
your focus changes when you sit in this seat versus sitting out
Yeah,
in the town as the
yeah,
collector of delinquent taxes or
Yes.
just participating in the select board meetings of the
absolutely.
village. And
But you should see more property on the local grand list when the law takes effect.
Other questions? Yes.
So our Ways and Means Committee right now is working on the non-homestead property classification. So they must be including and
Presumably, they're
property.
going to take into
Yeah.
account how to value communications property and what that
Yeah.
means.
So that is delayed, maybe. And it's delayed because is it V-Trans that is doing it?
No, that's a separate
Oh my
issue. It's
goodness.
Department of Taxes. So it's Department of Taxes was given the money to come up with a valuation model, how to value communications
Right.
property. I'm not sure what the delay is. I just don't know.
It's complicated. What's V-Trans?
But that's the right of way
Right,
fee
right of way.
for using the state right of way, so like along highways, putting your infrastructure, poles, wires, antenna.
Mhm.
Under law, typically you pay a right of way fee for the privilege of being able to do that. Vermont, and it's collected by the Agency of Transportation. The law allows broadband and wireless providers, telecommunications providers, to ask for waiver from paying for the fee, and in return, and the theory was, and it says this in the statute, that the secretary can waive the fee if the secretary makes a determination that some comparable good will benefit the state and broadband, like build out of broadband. We don't know more taxes or fees than necessary. It's good for the state. We're just not going to charge you. That waiver, I think it could only go on for 5 years. It could not be renewed or something. The fact of the matter is, the fees have never been collected since 2007. And that was part of the discussion about what are we doing? Some companies are very lucrative. They're making a lot of money. And why aren't they paying money that can go to the transportation fund?
Okay.
Right. So that's part of the policy debate. So there were proposals last year that were very specific about what the rate should be, linear charge, blah, blah. Ultimately, what passed though was asking transportation to do a study, come out with what the formula should be, et cetera. And that study is due in October. And it should come to this committee because it specifies energy, the old energy committee, but that means.
Right, okay. It's nice to hear from you on that because I think somebody else brought it up. With Franklin.
Yeah.
Context of it.
Okay, yeah, you'll hear.
Thanks for that reminder. I knew I had
October.
done something,
Yeah, no, that was,
but I didn't remember the details.
Other questions?
Go back to the value of the telephone fiber. It's the fiber that's located within the town boundaries. And when we're talking about the use of the right of way, that's just the state highway right of way and perhaps state aid roads, but not.
that, I have to actually check on the language because certainly the statute that I reference is for the use of the state right of way. But municipalities could charge for the use of the
Their right away.
municipal
Of their,
right of
Right.
way. And I just have to look at the study language to see if it included use of the public rights of way generally, not just state. I just have to look at that. But I don't think there's any prohibition on municipalities as far as I know. Okay. As far as I know, and I just thought of something else. There's one exception,
Always.
and that's for cable companies that are providing cable television. I know they provide internet, I know they provide voice.
Yeah.
But for cable television, they have franchises. They pay a franchise fee of 5%. And that's in lieu of any
On
right of
cable
way fee
television.
for cable television.
Yeah.
Right, so that,
It's probably very quickly.
but that revenue is going down. A lot of people are cutting the cord, not using this cable subscription service as much. Maybe they just want the broadband access. And that fee is only on the television revenue. So as it goes down, then the state might want to rethink. Is this franchise fee a fair charge for their use of the public right of way?
Okay.
Feel like I've confused you.
No, this is,
And
well,
I know I've confused myself.
no, it's the way that everything went from telephone to cable TV to adding, what they call the LDS,
DSL.
DSL.
yeah.
So the initial DSL, they waited for the build out of repeaters or amplifiers.
Yeah.
As they expanded the system, and then the fiber has come along, and so
Just interesting to see the patterns,
the evolution of the.
considering the regulatory frame is not the same for each of those.
Right, and I think the concern of as the costs of operating go up, depending on the size of the company, the rate pressure that it has. I mean, if somebody's going to transfer money, they're going to get it from someplace, and they're going to get it through rates.
Which are not regulated.
Well,
They're not regulated for the smaller, the independents. But consolidated is price capped, so they can't, for basic local exchange voice service, there's a cap.
no matter whether they get it over fiber or, but they're not.
Just the voice service.
The fact that they may be using a voice over internet line doesn't matter to Consolidated, but it would to some of these other carriers you can subscribe to independently.
Well, they're not rate regulated. And that's because the PUC made a determination that it's a competitive in the state. There's enough competition that the market forces will keep the telephone service monthly price relatively low. So.
Thank you, Maria.
You're welcome.
Hey, Jack.